Hi, this is Andrew Scheps at Studio La Fabrique. I just finished up my week-long seminar here, and we have a few more questions to answer. So here's the first one. I'm going to get this name wrong. From Kozeboze? Kozboz, I'm sorry, I've just butchered your name. But first up, thanks for all your great work. Well, thank you. If you were to mix a song in the box without a traditional console, would you still use some outboard as inserts on channels and buses in combination with plugins, or would you go only with plugins to skip all the hassle once you are in the box? That's a good question, because I do mix in the box sometimes still, even though most of my mixes are on the console. Usually when I'm in the box, I just stay completely in the box, because either I'm finishing a mix that has been started in the box while the production was going on, or I'm doing it that way because I need to be portable and I want to be able to work with it on my laptop. And so if I start using outboard gear, it's a problem. And now with all of the plug-in emulations of the hardware that are around, you can usually get pretty close to what you're used to with the console. So obviously the concepts are really different and the gain structure and all of that, but you can really set up sessions in a way where it's familiar. So yeah, I just stay completely in the box. All right, next question. From Jesse Miller, a much easier to pronounce name for me. Thank you for taking time to answer our questions. You're welcome. Is mixing an LCR a hard rule for you, or are you flexible? Have you always mixed LCR, and if so, why? And if not, what specifically drew you towards your use of LCR? Okay, so I think basically what Jesse's talking about is the idea of all of the instruments in the mix either being on the left, the right, or in the center. There isn't a whole lot of placement in between left and center and right and center. And the real answer to that is that I mix on an old Neve console, and it has a button for the left speaker, a button for the right speaker, and if you want to pan in between, you actually have to switch in a pan circuit, and it drops the level, and I don't like that. So I almost always hard pan, but it's really just because of the hardware I'm mixing on. And now I'm used to that sound, but when I mix in the box, I'll sometimes pan in between, and sometimes when I'll set up a stereo output of Pro Tools and pan inside Pro Tools, even though on the console it's hard left and right. So it's something I got used to, and now I kind of like it. All right. Question from AJ Steele. Mixing LCR. So apparently the fact that I mix LCR is big news. Mixing LCR, do you find the middle sounds quieter than the left and right, but when you collapse the mix to mono, the center is the loudest, which is good. I get a little worried that the left and right are too loud, but my mix seems to be okay in mono to me. We actually talked about that this week quite a bit, because there was a question about checking your mixes in mono, and initially my response was, well, I really don't care what it sounds like in mono, because most people will be listening in stereo. Even if it's a low quality MP3 or off YouTube, it's still stereo. But then it was pointed out to me that a lot of people listen on their iPhone speaker, which is of course mono. So mono does matter, but I would never change a mix because of it. I think if you check a mix in mono, you might think, oh, okay, now my balance is not right, but you should always go back to stereo before trying to fix the balance. I'm not one of those people who does their panning and their balances in mono and then goes back to stereo. So maybe checking in mono could help you notice something that's wrong that you're not noticing when you listen in stereo, but fix it for the way it sounds in stereo, because I think 90% of the time that's how people hear it. And if you're tailoring your mixes for how it sounds on an iPhone speaker, then that's just not where people are going to listen, and it's not what's important, to me anyway. That's what I think. Next question. From Germán Gutierrez Ross. I tried. It's probably wrong. Hi, Andrew Scheps. Hope you had a good time in La Fabrique. Such a great studio. I definitely had a great time. It is a fantastic studio. I admire your job. Thanks for answering these questions. Do you think it makes sense to spend a lot of money on a digital clock instead of a converter's clock or Pro Tools sync clock, even if you do not have a lot of different digital devices? Okay. That's a good question, and I think my answer to it has changed over the years. Back when Pro Tools had the 888s, their clock was really not very good, and I had an Arg sync as an external clock, and it definitely made everything sound better. Now, I think that the clocks inside most professional interfaces are very, very good. The clock makes a huge difference. So if you have equipment with bad clock, then using an external clock is a really good idea. But I really think at that point, you should spend the money upgrading to a better audio interface, because you'll get better analog electronics, better converters, along with a better clock. And in general now, my feeling is that most equipment sounds the best when it's clocked internally. Because as soon as you're on an external clock, you're bringing in other circuits that help it follow the clock, and it just, most gear sounds best internally. So when I'm working in Pro Tools with multiple interfaces, I usually have either the first interface as the clock or the interface that my mix is printing into as the master clock, and then I use loop sync. I'll only use the sync IO if I have to sync up with external timecode, or I want to vary speed while I'm recording or something, but then I switch back to internal clock, and that sounds the best to me. So I would say, unless you can really spend a bunch of money, just get the best audio interface you can, and that will usually have a pretty good clock. All right. Another one. I won't even say your name again, because if I got it wrong the first time, it's only going to be worse. Hi again, Andrew. Hello again. I have many questions, as you can see. I've understood you engineered and mixed the Chili Peppers' last record. Greg Fiddleman did the basic recording. I recorded a lot of the overdubs along with Greg, and then I did mix most of that record. I've noticed a lot of distortion on that record, and it rules. Did you record onto tape? Those distortions are from tape, the limit your Neve desk, or maybe because of the mastering. They initially did some recording onto tape, but we ended up using most of the tracks straight into Pro Tools, so the tape didn't win in a battle of tape versus straight Pro Tools. My Neve definitely adds distortion. The way I mix with parallel compression and all of the level adds some distortion, and sometimes I would just add distortion. So the distortion comes from all over the place, and I like the sound of it. Just a little bit of harmonic distortion is part of the way my console sounds. So it comes from everywhere. I don't know that we really added any in mastering on that particular record. I mean, I think the mastering was pretty close to the mixes. So yeah, so distortion came from everywhere. And thank you very much. All right, from Brett Caldas Lima. How do you feel about the final output of projects you have mixed, clipping, mastering, and such? Okay, so that's a very subtle question about some very specific records that I've been involved in. Basically, I won't talk about the clipping. What I'll talk about is, first of all, from the previous question, I enjoy distortion. I'm fine with that. That doesn't mean that I enjoy all the distortion that's on all the records I've ever worked on. But it's not my record, it's the artist's record, and on some of those records there's a separate producer, so if they're happy with the final product, then I'm happy with the final product. It's not up to me always at the very end of the decision-making process, so it's just important for me to try and make it sound as good as I can, and sometimes distortion makes it sound good, so yeah, I just make it sound great, and then sometimes it's not my decision, and we'll leave it at that. From Daryl Stewart. Oh, I'm sorry, Daryl Swart. Hi, Andrew. Love your work. Thank you. Very inspiring. What is your opinion on using analog summing when mixing in the box? What are the reasons for your answer? I would say if you're mixing in the box, in general, I don't think that analog summing is something you absolutely have to do. Especially with the newer summing boxes, they're very, very clean, and I don't know that it's really that much of a different sound than the summing inside of Pro Tools Digital Mixer or any of the other DAWs digital mixers, because they're very clean, and especially with floating point, you have infinite headroom up until the very end. The biggest thing about it is when you split up to go into analog summing, you're using the D to A converters to get into each channel of that, and so you're going to sort of a final gain stage before you've put everything together. So that really changes how you have to work with the headroom inside the mixer. So you could be much hotter in the mixer because you're going to split it out, and you're not going to be hitting the converters as hard as if you sum it all in the box. But in terms of just the sound of it, if you're not going to have a Neve or an API or some, I mean, it doesn't have to be an old thing, it could be a new thing, but if it isn't something that actually has harmonic distortion and a lot of wire and metal and transformers and things that really has a sound, then I don't know what you're gaining, other than having to use more converters, and it takes more time and it's harder to recall. So in general, unless you're really going for a specific sound of the summing box, I don't think it's really worth it. And another from Jesse Miller. This is an interesting question. With your background in drum programming and source creation, how do you mentally turn off the source creation section of your brain and get on with mixing what you have available from the artist? As in, do you hear parts in your head that are not there, and how do you work around that? That's a really interesting question, because it's not only about programming and being a musician or things like that. I think it also ties into producing versus engineering. And all the time while I'm working on a mix, let's say, I'll have ideas about how to finish the song, and that's what makes it finish. So I always, if I'm just employed as a mixer, I'll always try and work just with the source material I've got. And sometimes I might add an effect that wasn't there, and that can be just a subtle way to add something. Sometimes I will create what might look like drum programming, but I'll create it with delays or different effects to start creating parts that aren't there, but they're all made from the parts that are there. Sometimes I'll create harmony vocals because it feels as though that will make it sound better, and sometimes I'll just go ahead and record myself playing an instrument because I really feel that it'll help the song. And then you have to read the situation as to, do you just bury it in there and hope nobody notices, or do you say, your song is amazing, but it really needed this one thing, so I hope that's okay, and maybe you'll replace it with something better than what I did. But usually when you do something like that, if you frame the way you present it to the artist in the right way, they're really happy that you've done something, or it'll give them an idea as to what they could do that's better, and they'll go and finish it in a different way. But I'm always hearing things, and it's just a matter of, do I create it from what I was given, or do I really have to go ahead and just put new instruments on it? But that side of my brain, I don't think it ever gets switched off, because otherwise you would just put up the faders and you'd be done, because it's all the same thing. All right. And a question from Rodney Melvin. What are your views on this whole Pandora and other online music streaming service? Is it great for music because it allows more people to tune in at a moment's notice? Do you think it will eventually only be beneficial for the major labels? Okay, that's a big, big question. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about this, but I'll try and give the short version. There are two questions in there, and those two questions really go to the core of what I think about the services. So in terms of music discovery, I think it's really important, and I think YouTube is as big a part of that as the actual music streaming services. So people being able to listen to music is amazing, and obviously it only works for people like me who make records if that makes people buy the records, and then that money gets back to the artists, and then the artists use that money to hire people who make records. Because for the artists, they have other ways they can make money, but for people who just make records, if people don't buy records, we're out of work. So I think it's important for music discovery. I think some of the services are really cool in the way you can find things, and I think they need to do a much better job of driving people to actually buy the records. Because the payments that they make are tiny. So that goes to the second part of the question, which is, do you think it will eventually only be beneficial for the major labels? I think already it's only beneficial for the major labels, because the payments for each stream are so small that unless you own 5 million songs, it's not enough money. There are major artists who don't get a lot of money even though they have millions of streams. So with my independent label, there's money that comes in from YouTube and Pandora and Spotify and all the other streaming services, and that's great. But it's not enough money for us to make records with. So I think really the key is that the people who listen to the streaming services need to understand that they need to give their money to the artists if they really like the music. If they kind of like it, they got a chance to listen to it for free on their end and for very cheap on the services end, so that can be great, but eventually it needs to turn into real money for the artists, and that's the part that is missing. And now a question from Stephen M. Borden, and we will never know what that M stands for unless he responds to this video, so check the comments. How would you define your approach in terms of EQ and compression or other ideas to obtain clarity between the bass guitar and kick drum in a rock arrangement? Thanks, Andrew. I'm a big fan of your mixes. Thanks, Stephen. I'm a big fan of your middle initial, and I want to know what it stands for. This is something that a lot of mixers talk about, and they have really specific ideas about how they treat the bass and the kick drum. I've seen people talk about one wraps around the other, or one is above the other, one is below the other. I have no idea what I do. I think that usually what happens is that the kick drum has a much more rhythmic element than the bass, and so that's where I try and get the distinction, that the kick drum is really pounding and is a big part of the rhythm of the track, and obviously it has some low end, and the bass is much more the foundation of the instruments. So the low end from the bass is more of a constant thing, and the low end from the kick drum is more of a rhythmic thing. And then using the top end of the kick drum is where you can get more of the rhythm and the way it interacts with the snare and guitars and things like that. So in terms of frequencies and compression and EQ, I have absolutely no idea. And every mix, I use the same tools, but I do them slightly differently. But I think that that's the key, is to let them do different things in the low end. And the other key is to make sure other instruments don't have extra low frequencies that are down there messing around with them. Really let the bass and the kick, if it's a straight ahead rock thing, be the only two things down there. And that way they can fight for space, but they don't have to fight with the guitars and stuff like that. And that's it. Thanks.